Well, welcome back to this second teaching moment. In our first teaching moment, we went through the storyline of the book of Revelation. And that was important because we want to understand how the author has taken these words and chosen to package them to communicate this message to us. And as we go through these teaching moments, what we'll do is we'll take that message and we'll interpret it and try to discern, okay, what does this message mean? What are the future events that maybe this message is trying to communicate to us? How do we interpret that message? That's where we're going in this series of teaching moments. But where we started was with the text and trying to figure out what is the storyline of the text. That was last week. This week, today, we're going to ask the questions of who wrote this book and when did they write it, right? Authorship and dating. And that's significant because it places this book into a moment in history, and it might influence how we interpret the book later on. So for example, if this book was written during the time period that there was a Jewish revolution and there was this Jewish war with Rome going on, well, someone might possibly interpret this book as predicting events that were going to unfold with the Jewish revolt, as it were, in 70 AD. One of the possible interpretations. That's where we're going. We're going to understand those interpretations, but one of the key factors we can start with is authorship and dating. So let's take a look at who exactly wrote this book. And we do not know with 100% certainty who actually wrote it, because the author of the book, what we do know is the person who wrote these words said their name was John. We heard that in two different places in this book. And we also saw that this person who wrote the book identified themselves as a servant of Jesus, one of Jesus' servants. What other big fact do we know? This is someone who is a faithful witness for Jesus. Likely that implies that this person walked with Jesus. This person knew Jesus. He was involved with the events that unfolded with Jesus' ministry. So those are the key facts that we know. Now, we can make some reasonable assumptions as well, right? Besides the key facts where it explicitly says it in Scripture, some of the reasonable assumptions that we can make is that this guy John is well known and recognized, right? He wrote this letter and he addresses it in particular to 7 different churches, and he only uses his first name. He doesn't say Paul of Tarsus. He doesn't say John of wherever. He just says John, the servant John. You know me, John, right? So this person is probably well known, this John figure. Another reasonable assumption we can make is that this author John likely visited Asia Minor. The reason for that is because the address of these 7 churches, the order that they're placed in, is the exact order that you would go in if you were to walk to each of these churches. The order that they're placed in is actually in geographical order. So you would first start, if you were to go and visit and to be the messenger holding these letters, you would start at Ephesus. That place by the sea, that port. And you would start at Ephesus, and then you would work your way through Asia Minor. And as you work through Asia Minor, the order of the churches you would run into on the road would be the exact order that they're written in this book. They're written in geographical order. Kind of interesting. What that does, though, is it gives us a bit of knowledge that the author who wrote this knew that information themselves, right? They likely had traveled that road. They likely had visited or were familiar with this geographical region, likely would have visited somewhere like Ephesus and gotten familiar with it. So we know these 2 reasonable assumptions here. Our first reasonable assumption, John is well known, right? He can just say, my name's John. And another one, he's likely visited this geographical region of the world. Okay, from there, from what the facts are that we know, and from the reasonable assumptions, we can come to a few different conclusions. Who would be key candidates to be authors of this book? Now, one of the possible authors is John, the disciple, the apostle, right? The guy who walked with Jesus, wrote the Gospel of John, right? He would be high up there on this list. They would know him by the first name, right? Another one is John Mark. the author of the Gospel of Mark. A third one is this guy named Elder John. And this guy, Elder John, is a candidate because this author later on in history named Papias, he wrote a document that seemed to reference this figure called Elder John. And so scholars sometimes say, well, Elder John, that's another person in the running. Hey, he probably wrote this book. He seemed to be well known, right? He was known by Papias and referenced. And the last one is this idea that this book was written by someone not named John. It was written by someone completely different, and this is in the running because books that are apocalyptic in nature, apocalyptic literature, often they are written by people who are not the person named in the book. Sometimes they have a made-up name that they're using. So for example, some of the books that would use this sort of reference is like a book like Enoch, right? The book of Enoch likely was not written by actual Enoch, the guy way back in Genesis. It was pretty widely accepted, even by Jewish readers in the ancient times, that this was not written by Enoch, this was written by someone else under the name of Enoch. He was assuming that name as he wrote this piece of literature. So it's something that does happen from time to time, and it's in the running of possible authors. Someone totally different writing under the name of John, which seems a little bit weird if you think about it, because he doesn't say the disciple John, the apostle John. If he was going to make up a name, you think he would use a proper name, the full name. That way people wouldn't be confused who he was claiming to be. Now there is one particular person in this list of running potential authors that has the most evidence behind them. And that person is actually the Apostle John. And the reason for that is because early tradition, all the early writers during this time period are unanimously, 100% attributing this book of Revelation to this guy, the Apostle John. And this little quote here, the early tradition is unanimous in its opinion that the Apocalypse, this book of Revelation, was written by John the Apostle. That's actually a quote from Dr. Robert Mounce in his New International Commentary on the New Testament. And I've included a list of examples of what kind of people are we talking about here that are attributing this book directly to the Apostle John. Well, that would be Justin Martyr, Eusebius, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian. All these famous authors and more directly attribute this book to have been written by the Apostle John. So the evidence supporting the Apostle John is overwhelming when you start to look at early writers from that time period. And one particular person on this list is an outstanding source, right? One particular person on this list totally excites scholars of this time period, and that is Irenaeus in particular. Because Irenaeus, if you think about where he came from, his lineage, John the Apostle, and most of the disciples of Jesus, they themselves had disciples, all right? They themselves had people follow them, and they taught those disciples everything that Jesus had taught them. Well, John the disciple, John the apostle of Jesus, he had a disciple named Polycarp, and Polycarp had a disciple named Irenaeus. So this guy Irenaeus, he comes directly from the list of disciples. He likely heard it from Polycarp's mouth, who heard it directly from John the source, saying this book is an authoritative witness from the Apostle John. It has that stamp of an apostle on it. And that's why this guy Irenaeus is such a powerful witness to the authorship of this book, because he comes directly from the line of disciples from John himself. So, this unanimously attributing it to John the Apostle, there's almost not really a reason that the evidence falls short as we start to look at these other potentials in that list of possible authors. So as we approach this book of Revelation, even though we don't know exactly, even though it says John and not Apostle John, as we look at the evidence, it seems to clearly point to the Apostle John as being the author of this book. Now, one of the other parts that we need to look at as we think about this book of Revelation is the dating of this book. So as we think about the dating of Revelation, what I've done for you to kind of help you out is I've made a little timeline here of Roman emperors during the time that this book could likely have been written. And where it starts is with this Emperor Nero, and he reigned from 54 to 68 AD. And then you can see the kind of list goes through. And then over here I have Domitian. And it's not because there's no emperors after him. It's because these two particular people, Nero and Domitian, are two key emperors that scholars look to date and place this book of Revelation. They likely think that the book of Revelation was written either during the time of Nero or during the time of Domitian. So let's look at why. Why would they think it would be written during one of those two time periods? Now, what is the evidence for the early dating, for that time period of Nero, for the authorship of the book of Revelation? So I'm going to throw up a couple pieces of evidence. These are the key ones. There's more, but this gives you a good taste of what it is we're looking at. And some of the key pieces of evidence, one of them is that the word Caesar Nero, it equates to the number 666. And I know that's kind of a complicated idea if you're familiar with kind of Hebrew ideas and the way they've created their alphabet and their number and word system. Basically, in Western idea, we have our alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, and our number system, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, as two separate systems. But in Hebrew writing, they're the same system. So A is 1, B is 2, C is... That's kind of the idea behind the Hebrew number and alphabet system. And so if we were to take the word Caesar Nero and count up the numbers associated with those letters, it would equal 666. That's interesting. That doesn't quite really happen when we do it with Domitian, right? We can't get that number. And since that's a number that's significant in this book, authors quote that as a key piece of evidence, right? Another key piece of evidence is that this book starts to make references to the temple and temple sacrifices happening. Well, after 70 AD, the temple is destroyed. There is no more temple. So if this book was written during the time of Domitian, later on, there would be no temple, and it wouldn't make sense to make those references to sacrifices if that's occurring a good decade after the temple is gone. Nothing there. So since the temple is being referred to, it seems a reasonable piece of evidence that it would be written during the time period of Nero. Another piece of evidence that we see there is that some of the events associated with, say, the trumpets, the bowls, and the seals, some scholars like to take those events and associate them with the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So they would see this book as in part predicting those events of destruction, right? So they would see that as a piece of evidence, because when you look back in history, some of those events, they line up a bit with what we're seeing in the book of Revelation. Another piece of evidence would be the Nero resurrection myth. Now, in the book of Revelation, in the latter parts of it, you'll start to notice that there's this weird thing where the beast gets slain, and then it looks like it's more than it resurrects from the dead and it comes back to life. Well, during that time period, there was a myth going around that Nero was going to raise from the dead. He had died and been mortally wounded, and he was going to come back, right? And so there was this common myth being spread about the empire. And the exact dating of that myth gets a bit muddy. It gets disputed of, okay, when did that myth really come about? Was that actually during the time of Nero, or was it just referencing Nero? Or there's a little bit of dispute about that piece of evidence, but there is a myth common that during this general region of time that Nero was going to be resurrected. And that kind of lines up with some of the events we see in the book of Revelation. So these are 4 key pieces of evidence that would support maybe an early dating of the book of Revelation, that it was written during that time period of Nero. So somewhere between 54 AD and 68 AD. Now, what about the later dating, right? This is probably the dating that is most common in Christian scholarship. So many scholars, many commentators on the book of Revelation end up leaning towards this dating, and it has to do with the last piece of evidence, which we will dive into a little bit more. But some of the key pieces of evidence is there was more widespread persecution during the time of Domitian. So basically what's happening as we look at both of these time periods where these two emperors were reigning is scholars and historians look at those time periods and they say, do the events during that time period, do they correlate more closely with the book of Revelation for the earlier or more closely with the book of Revelation for the later? And so they're trying to figure out where does the context of this book fit in history. And during the time of Domitian, there's persecution more widely rampant across the entire empire. Now, that's not to say that there isn't persecution during the time of Nero, but it was more centralized to Rome itself, not as widespread across the entire Roman Empire. More widespread persecution during Domitian. Okay, piece of evidence. Another one is as we look at the letters to the 7 churches in chapters 2 and 3, it speaks of a spiritual decline in these churches. So for example, the church in Ephesus had lost its first love. We see the church in Laodicea is neither hot nor cold. They've kind of become lukewarm. And the idea behind it is someone arguing a later dating would say, well, that would take time. It would take time for their love for Jesus to grow cold. It would take time for the church to become lukewarm. And so the later dating provides more time for the churches and their spiritual condition to decline from their original planting of those churches. That can be disputed, but it's one of the key pieces of evidence for the later dating. Another one is as we look at those letters to the 7 churches in chapters 2 and 3, it mentions particular heretical groups like the Nicolaitans, for example. Now, the presence of these heretical groups, someone from the later dating would say, well, that would take time to develop these heretical teachings as well. And so likely this is during a later period in Christian history, the later dating. And one of the ways that can be argued is to say that, well, in that early period of 54 to 68, you would have the apostles still walking around, right? Some of the apostles were still up walking around. And so it would take, those apostles would easily be able to counter the heretical teachings, and it would take more time. We would need more of those apostles to kind of die off in order for us to really see the heretical teaching take root and become so prevalent. That can be disputed, but that's the train of thought for that piece of evidence. The last one here is the comment by Irenaeus. There is one particular comment that is very, 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 very key. It is probably the most critical piece of evidence to support this Domitian time period. This is the piece of evidence that gets referred to when they're really trying to bat it out of the park, that it's Domitian, not Nero. Let's take a closer look at that piece of evidence. Because remember, this guy Irenaeus, this comment by Irenaeus, this is John Polycarp Irenaeus. This is the key guy that we go to say this book is written by John. And now we're going to go to him to see when was it written. So this comment by Irenaeus, this is a translation of it. And here it is for you. I'll read it for you. We will not, however, incur the risk of pronouncing positively as to the name of the Antichrist. See, he's making comments on this book of Revelation. For if it were necessary that his name should be distinctly revealed in this present time, it would have been announced by him who beheld the apocalyptic vision. So he's referencing John there. By him who beheld the apocalyptic vision. For that was seen not very long time since, but almost in our day towards the end of Domitian's reign. So we see a direct reference to Domitian in this quote, and the disputed part of it and how this would be argued by a later dating is it would say, for that, the revelation, this book itself, right, has not been seen very long since, but almost in our time period towards the end of Domitian. This book was written during the time period of Domitian. But here's the thing. Let's pull up our little timeline and get a little reference bar here, because the early time period people, they would look at that word that and say that is referring to the author, John. We haven't seen this author, John. We haven't seen him for a very long time since, but almost in our day, towards the end of Domitian's reign. That's the last time we saw John. We saw him in Domitian's reign. Okay. The later time period are looking at that word that and saying that word is the revelation itself, the vision. John saw this vision late, almost towards the end of Domitian's reign. So this quote, this key piece of evidence, is disputed, and it is not exactly straightforward. It's the reason why I presented two different models, is because these two get disputed all the time. And depending on how we interpret this book, as you'll see as we move on through these teaching moments, some of the interpretations prefer earlier dating, some of them prefer later dating. It's good to know that there's arguments that can be made either way, because likely if you go and buy a commentary and open it up, they'll say, for sure, 100%, there's no doubt in the world it was written during 54 AD. Or they might say, for sure, no doubt whatsoever, 100% certainty, it was written during, in the 80s. So we have to hold that with an open hand. We can know with pretty good certainty that the Apostle John wrote the book, but it's disputed. It's probably between one of these two time periods that it was actually written. Cool. Well, there you go. You got a little bit of the authorship and the dating. And from here on, we're going to focus more on now what lens, what glasses are we putting on as we look at this book and try to interpret it? And how are our interpretations of this book being shaped? All right. Enjoy reading the book of Revelation, and I'm enjoying reading it with you.